Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, my brief understanding of each survivor's lore and associated design, and their placements on this lore tier list. Yeah, I know people have wanted this one for a little while now. Back in March I did a video putting every killer in Dead by Daylight on a tier list system ranking my personal takes on their lore. Anybody who's interested, by the way, here's a dated version of that list with the Singularity and Xenomorph placed on it, and the adjustment to Skull Merchant's placement to take her tome story into account. A ton of people wanted a Survivor version of this list, and half a year later, here I am finally getting around to it. But before I get started, there's one thing I want to reiterate. Tier lists, really anywhere, are matters of interpretation or opinion, but this one more than most that you'll typically see lying around. If you disagree with elements of this list, hell, even if you disagree with all of it, that's totally cool and good. Such is the joy of stories, there's no right answer. I said this word for word at the start of my killer tier list video, and I just want to repeat it here before I continue. This list will mostly be ordered within the tiers, and I'll bear in mind the base story and any appearances in DBD media like tomes when making my decisions, so let's crack on. Just like with my killer tier list, I'm going to make a separate category at the bottom where several of the licensed characters invariably end up. The unordered L tier. A lot of DBD's licensed characters don't really get any lore at all. They give it a few sentences perhaps, a paragraph at most, to more or less give them an excuse for being in the fog in lieu of giving them any serious story content. The characters aren't explored at all, and it's unclear whether it's because license holders don't want behaviour to have too much wiggle room when it comes to their characters, or because behaviour doesn't give enough of a fuck to write something for themselves. Honestly, I fear it could be a bit of both. The L tier isn't really for bad lore per se, it's for lore that doesn't even qualify as lore in the first place. It is disqualified because there isn't enough story presented to us to actually value it with any depth. Laurie, Steve, Nancy, Ripley, Jill, Leon, Ada and Rebecca inhabit the L tier of this list, and if you read their stories, you'll see why. Their introduction to less of integrations between their canon and Dead by Daylights, and more like a tweet, a piece of marketing that says, hey, go play Resident Evil or watch Halloween instead of sitting here reading this.
Wow, look, nothing!
These are so terminally low effort that they don't even really deserve to spot on the list at all, so the L tier exists to tie them all up into a neat little bow so we can forget about them and move on. The tier proper begins in the D tier, with survivors who I think have some deeply flawed stories. Maybe they had some potential once, but they've all had tomes that have either done nothing to help the glaring issues their base lore had, or in some case even doubled down on these problems or created new ones. Nia, Vittorio, Dwight, Jonah and Bill all have pretty weak stories, and of them I think Nia and Dwight have the potential to not be total dogshit. Dwight was meant to be this reluctant and anxious leader, a Shaun of the Dead type figure who struggled in ordinary life, but finds himself surprisingly well suited to being the central of a group in times of crisis. Unfortunately, he's never actually shown to be that, with behaviour choosing to focus instead on him being a hapless loser, without showing us leadership skills at all. We're told he's a nervous leader and are expected to just believe that without any proof. Dwight's tome could have corrected this, but if anything it did the opposite, showing us that Dwight doesn't think his plans through, and puts the people around him in danger of getting revenge, which are pretty much the opposite traits you want for a leader to have. The insistence that Dwight is a good leader, despite every possible indication inferring that he's fucking terrible at it, rankles me deeply. And if you want a full video of me shitting on Dwight's presentation as an alleged leader, let me know and I will do it, because it really grinds my gears. Nia is a little bit better, since her presentation doesn't actively run counter to what we've already been told about her, but her story and especially her tomes run on the idea of her being a very boring and insincere person. Her base lore isn't too bad for this. It kind of relies on her being unable to do anything about her circumstances rather than being unwilling necessarily. But her tome is an absolute drag. Throughout the story, we're shown a proactive, driven, and conscientious young woman who exhorts her apathetic friend to become a better person. But for some reason, that conscientious young woman is not Nia. It's her friend Casey, who spends the entire story effectively dragging Nia around like a millstone because she doesn't give enough of a shit about anyone or anything else to contribute to the story at all. And when she does, it's a purely hollow gesture, meant to come across as her sticking it to the man in her own way, but winds up just feeling like a token gesture that she just did to get Casey off her back. Making a lazy, disinterested or apathetic main character isn't impossible, but to make it work you can't have her getting basically forced into doing anything at all by other people, but that's how you get a character who's just annoying and unenthusing. If she doesn't care about and can't be bothered to be a part of the world around her, why should we care about her or want to be part of her world? Vittorio is an interesting case, because when he released I was quite positive about his lore. Sadly, much like the rest of Forged in Fog, it aged like milk on a hot day, and after a direly underwhelming tome, Vittorio got hit by this way harder than the Knight did. Forged in Fog is a very stylistically minded chapter, with its over-the-top, grimdark edginess captured authentically in the Knight's tome, and Vittorio is kind of meant to be the antithesis of that. Someone who believed in the power of reason, kindness and mercy to win the day, but that idealism is so sloppily written it makes Vittorio feel like a massive idiot. He's meant to be this intellectual, the thinking man to tarnish his role as a violent, blunt instrument. But in his tome especially, he seems borderline dopey, painfully frustratingly ignorant in a way that goes beyond simple naivete and just makes him frustrating to read about. His visual appearance doesn't help. He's meant to be a 13th century lord, but he looks like he runs a hipster coffee shop in Soho. And while his lore does surrender us an excuse to be the way he is, that's all that is, an excuse. It's just another way his character fits together poorly and makes Vittorio an unignorably irritating part of DBD's cast of characters. You'll notice I've left Jonah and Bill for last at the bottom of D tier, and that's because I feel like they deserve to be talked about together. Anybody who hears the name Jonah Vasquez around me knows how much I hate this guy. His lore is poorly conceived at a fundamental level, and pairing a sympathetic CIA agent with more blood in his hands than half the Killer roster, with a killer who was heavily based on a Chilean musician killed by the CIA-backed Pinochet regime, was legendarily tone-deaf even by behaviour standards. Jonah's tome turned his story from thousands of innocent people die on his watch, his employer with a long history of shady cover-ups covered it up, and he felt a bit sad about the whole thing, to this man is so utterly incompetent that his antics escaping the black veil and uncovering the truth feel like parody. I really dislike Jonah's lore, and I've been very vocal about this before, so much so that some of you might be wondering why it isn't the lowest. That's because unfortunately for any Left 4 Dead fans out there, Bill's tome exists. As similar to my condemnation of Amanda's story in Tome 10, I think behaviour shitting all over somebody else's story is infinitely more heinous than to be shitting over their own characters. Bill's story more or less mutilates Left 4 Dead's canon. Yeah, there really isn't a better word for it than mutilates, because the version of Bill and the other 3 members of the Survivor crew, Zoe, Lewis and Francis, presented by this story bear almost no resemblances to their original portrayals. Left 4 Dead is driven by the chemistry between these 4 unlikely allies, and Bill's tome totally misunderstands it, side-eyeing Lewis completely and making the dialogue between Bill, Zoe and especially Francis feel entirely hollow, like it was some off-brand Left 4 Dead rip-off. Bill's tome, alongside Amanda's, represents the lowest point of DBD storytelling for me, a thoughtless and heartless regurgitation of images present in original source material without any understanding of them or the characters they're meant to depict. I love to hate Jonah's story. It's so absurd and so comprehensively questionable that it becomes a point of mockery, a running gag. But Bill's just sort of makes me sad. I think any Left 4 Dead fans who got excited about this story when it was announced feel the same way. What a tragic waste. Well, that's D tier covered, so things can only get better as we move up to C tier, featuring Jake, Kate, Gabriel, Claudette, and Feng Min. Let's start at the bottom with Feng Min, who I think is just a giant bundle of potential waiting to happen. Feng Min is by far the oldest original character in Dead by Daylight to have not yet received a tome, and her portrayal is really starting to show its age. For its time, Feng Min's story was far more serious and, real than most Survivor stories, taking a genuinely discomforting look at gaming addiction and the pressure your family and your job can put on you. This was a great starting point for a deeply serious and incisive study into some very real topics, but Feng Min's presentation, basically everywhere else since then, has pretty much abandoned that. Everything from her perk descriptions to her cosmetics to her absolute desolation of any follow-up stories feels like at best it's forgotten the emotional core of Feng's story, and at the worst seems like it's trying to bury it. Don't get me wrong, Feng Min has amazing potential for a tome if they return to the serious portrayal of her that's largely been abandoned, but since near catatonic depression and alcoholism don't sell skins, I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. Feng Min being here in this case is less of a commentary on how her story itself was written, and more of an expression of how frustrated I am in how her character has been maintained both by the developers and by the fans by doing to her the very thing that her story condemns. flattening her identity and her struggles to keep up appearances of endless marketable hype, and causing significant long-term damage to her character as a result. Maybe it'll get better, maybe it won't. But suffice to say, it'll take a damn good tome to bring her character back on course. Only time will tell if she gets it. Anyone who sees my video on Claudette can probably guess why I have her so low on this list. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike Claudette as a character at all, but as someone on the autistic spectrum, seeing how Claudette's tome handled her autistic traits was pretty shite to say the least. I get it was an early tome, and there was always going to be some kinks to iron out. But presenting DBD's first and at the time only established autistic spectrum character as a problem child instead of an adult making her own decisions robbed her of agency and served to maintain the myth that autism is something that parents have to deal with, as if they're more important than their actual autistic kids. Talked about this more in my video on Claudette. I'm glad a lot of people resonate with her. It's just the first thing I think of when I think of Claudette's lore, and it's particularly clear to me now that we've got another all but confirmed autistic character who is handled with far more grace. But we'll get to him later. Jake and Kate both just kind of exist together in my brain with stories that are basically there. They're fine. But there's nothing in them that's really interesting, at least to me. They're both pretty solidly defined as characters, with Jake being isolated from his family and living in the woods as a hermit, while Kate uses her musical career to spread goodwill and bring people together. But I just think they're both lacking something special to really push them out of the bounds of mediocrity to make them genuinely memorable. They aren't bad stories. I think I'd put the cutoff point for bad stories at anything lower than these two. They're just not particularly good stories either. Jake's tome is alright, as his imaginary family bickers with him to highlight his self-doubts and frustrations, but it all feels very artificial. Jake doesn't act or talk like a real person and lessens the impact of the focused character story his tome is clearly going for. While Kate's story entertains the idea of her being some sort of anti-entity as a symbol of respite, but she really does nothing with the concept, meaning it ends up distracting from Kate's core entity as a beacon of hope. It's also aged like milk, now that we have actual entity-sensitive members of the cast on both sides who've engaged with, directly oppose, or were even created by the entity. What is playing a guitar going to do when literal psychics are becoming increasingly frequent inclusions of the cast? Gabriel is the interesting one here, sitting in the middle of C tier, because Gabriel is a character of two distinct halves. One half of genuinely effective sci-fi horror and another of truly earth-shattering amounts of stupidity that makes the story almost impossible to get through. On one hand, the world of the Huxley Corporation, its relentless expansionism and depth of space, is a really interesting one to pay a visit to, with its encroachment across the stars on the back of legions of clones, setting up some really interesting questions that Gabriel's tome begins to answer, showing us just enough of the behind the scenes at Huxley to suggest some horrifying implications, but withholding enough to let our imaginations run wild. Unfortunately, we have to visit this rich and horrifying new world in the clapped out old banger that is Gabriel and Hux's shared lore, where I can only assume some parasite in the air on Dvarka caused everyone's brain matter to decay exponentially as soon as you land on the planet, because that's the only way that the story makes anything even close to resembling sense. There are clumsy stories in Dead by Daylight, there are goofy stories in Dead by Daylight, there are jarring stories in the game that didn't quite come across the way the writer intended. Gabriel and Hux share one of Dead by Daylight's only truly stupid stories, and that keeps Gabriel tied down to C tier for me. This brings us up into the B tier, with Adam, Quentin, Jeff, Meg, Felix, Ace, and Jane. Everything from here on in is a story that I at least think is pretty good, or at worst doesn't have a problem glaring enough to discolour my view of the story. Felix I think is a decent enough survivor and was the first of a wave of characters for whom the entity was a major part of their lives. Unfortunately, Felix suffers from being easily the most forgettable of them. Not because of any particular failing of his own, but just because the others are more memorable than he is. Felix's story very competently delivers to us concepts like the pariahs for the first time, and begins to unravel the story of the entity cult on Earth that would really come into its own in A Binding of Kin, the chapter immediately after Felix's. While Blight's story dealt with the grand concepts and brought to life a character years in the making, Felix's story is a lot more grounded by showing us the after effects of what happens when the entity touches your life, and shatters your family like glass. Unfortunately, between the pariahs largely being out of focus in this story, and much of the immediate impact of his father's abduction being absent, Felix's story doesn't carry the emotional weight that it really should, and this makes Felix a prime candidate for a tome to flesh him out. I fully expect when he does get a tome he'll shoot up in the rankings, but as it stands, Felix doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table these days. Ace and Jane, I think, belong together. No, not like that. Unless... because while they're both fine characters on their own with tomes that are a lot of fun and definitely illustrate who they are, they do suffer from being sidelined by their relationships with their respective killers. Since the Hag is pretty much Curtis and Hex's The Killer, Ace is kind of set up as the guy who's born lucky, the kind of guy who will always land on his feet and can shrug off the worst misfortunes, and it sets him up as this fairly chill guy, who's fun to watch in action. But be that as it may, I think it flattens him a little bit, and I'd like to see the kind of person that eventually becomes Ace Visconti, what his day-to-day life is like, and whether he'd like something bigger in his life. He seems to treat life as one giant party, which is well and good, but leaves him kind of flat, and there's a lot of potential here to build the lore of the midlife crisis up into something more generally memorable as something other than a meme. Jane similarly acts as contrast to her killer, the Plague, as Demise of the Faithful has a wider theme of fallen idols, and similar to Adira's taking responsibility of leading her citizens to salvation, only to buckle under the pressure, Jane's successful career as a talk show host is torpedoed in an instant as her mother humiliates her on national television. But whereas the Plague struggle gets built up and paid off very effectively, and in a way that truly unravels the High Priestess of Babylon, Jane's feels more erratic, like they were just trying to get their copy out the door in time for the chapter's release. Adiris's fall from grace is handled with meticulous detail, so that we get to see her character develop from very specific events. Jane isn't given that much room by comparison, and it makes events like Loretta's interview feel like they've come out of nowhere. Jane misses out on a lot of the narrative beats that make her killer deliver on the chapter's theme much more successfully than she does. I think it prevents her from being as good as she could be. A fantastic idol with a fall that kind of comes out of nowhere and leaves her character confused as a result. Which brings me on to Meg. Meg is an interesting specimen because a lot of Meg's lore is not very good. As one of the original characters, her base lore is old as balls, and her tome isn't much younger. And there's a lot of elements to it that feel fractious, like they knew what they wanted to do but didn't really know how to do it. Meg's implied ADHD, the body shaming she receives at school, Meg taking out her energy on the track. All ideas that are pretty solid, but for the most part don't go anywhere. But then Meg's relationship with her terminally ill mother slams the brakes on everything and gives us some of the most heartfelt and emotionally raw dialogue in the history of the tomes. A lot of the tome stories struggle with getting the dialogue feeling natural, but Meg's conversations with her mother and the emotions behind them feel so human and so real that it's touching. A word I can only use for maybe a single-digit number of DBD stories ever written. Meg's story should not be as good as it is, but her dynamic with her mother elevates the whole story in a way that I can't justify giving it a lower ranking than this one. I simply can't. And this is where the stories start to pick up the pace a bit, because Jeff's story is how you do a thematic relationship between a killer and a survivor properly. Jeff and Frank of the Legion started off broadly the same, both teenagers living in Ormond with difficult family lives, and not a ton of clear prospects in life, who immerse themselves in exploits very typical of teenagers. Jeff becoming an amateur artist and metal music enthusiast, while Frank took up petty hooliganism and started to lead a gang of fellow miscreants. In another life, Jeff could easily have been part of that gang, another forgotten child of Ormond falling in with a bad crowd, but Jeff did something Frank never could. He grew up and moved on. Jeff's lore assumes that you, the reader, are smart enough to see what's right in front of you, and chooses to spend time instead fleshing out Jeff's growth in a way that highlights his journey into an emotionally mature and self-fulfilled man. Jeff is a great character in isolation, who is further enhanced by the context he's placed in, and if every survivor was written like Jeff, I'd be a very happy potato. Rounding out the top of beats here are Quentin and Adam, two certified gigachads who do not get the love they deserve. Quentin remains to this day one of the few good elements to the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, with a committed performance brought to life by Kyle Gollner, and DBD brings justice to this character by significantly expanding on his story from the film. The remake of Nightmare ends with a cliffhanger showing Freddy still at large in Springwood, and DBD's story for him follows Quentin taking up the mantle of Tired Boy in Chief to bring Freddy down once and for all. Not even to save himself, but instead to save Nancy. It's a natural progression of his arc that comes to a beautiful conclusion as Quentin effectively imprisons Freddy in the realm of the entity with him, ensuring his mission to save Nancy is complete, even as he suffers for eternity in her place. He might be effectively in hell, but by his own metrics, Quentin has already won, and doesn't seem to regret it for a second. What an absolute mad lad. Talk about making the best of a bad film, am I right? And Adam, well, I just love Adam. In many ways, Adam is very similar to Jeff. He stands well as his own character while also being a fun parallel to his killer, the hardworking teacher who emigrated to Japan for better prospects, and the hardworking student who comes from an old, proud Japanese traditional family that fell on hard times. He is at the same time effortlessly cool and kinda geeky, the sort of teacher who you could implicitly trust with your problems and would hold you to the same high standards of hard work he holds himself to. But what pulls him above Jeff and makes my number one most wanted character for a new tome is the biblical allusions present in many parts of his character that allude to a more noble and self-sacrificial side, turning Adam from just a regular good man into a veritable everyday hero. Adam is a giant stack of potential in a long white coat, and I seriously hope we see more of him soon. I'm sure you can hear in my tone of voice picking up, this means we're now into the A tier, with Yunjin, Yoichi, Nick Cage, Thalita, Ash, Cheryl, and Michaela. And let me start out by saying, when Michaela first came out, I thoroughly misjudged her. I covered this in a couple of videos before, but I kind of took out my discontent with DBD at the time on a character who broadly didn't deserve it, and that wasn't fair of me. If my first video addressing that original take last year and then my follow-up on Michaela's tone didn't make amends for that, I hope this video manages it, because Michaela is honestly pretty good. Her base lore sets her up fairly well as a young wannabe storyteller with a lot going on in her life and who hasn't fully found her place in the world yet, which was a real breath of fresh air after a year or two of hyper-competent 30-somethings who very much got their lives where they want them to be at this point, albeit with their fair share of hardships along the way. Her tome, however, is where things start to get really good, as Michaela receives visions of the horrors of the fog and translates them into dreams and stories that linger with her long after she's been dragged back to reality. Michaela's tome story is one of the best stories to read if you don't read much lore, but would like to get into it, or if you're a new player who wants to get into reading DBD's lore, because it retakes a lot of concepts that the Observer stories played with, big exposition-y eldritch shit, and presents them in a way that's easy to understand on a personal level. The entity's world is a big, mean and complex place, but Michaela's little trips there make it a digestible and vicariously enjoyable experience without compromising on the horror elements. In general, a highly successful tome story for a character I seriously missed the mark on. Now let's talk about Cheryl Mason, otherwise known as Heather, who was a tough act to follow after Silent Hill 3 knocked her story out of the park. Silent Hill 2 might get the lion's share of praise for the franchise, but Silent Hill 3 is certainly no slouch in its story, with Heather's uncertainties about growing up, and later grief at loss of her father as she leaves her childhood behind for good, becomes some of the best delivered themes in Silent Hill history. Dead by Daylight had a huge undertaking to adapt her faithfully into the game, and they rose to the challenge beautifully. DBD has a history of aging up underage characters for the game, and the same goes for Cheryl, as she was called in the game now to reflect her new name that she'd taken up following her father's death. Everything about her new implementation fits with the idea of the young teenager from Silent Hill 3, grown up into a young woman. Her job at a suicide hotline, the fact that she still misses her father but is no longer actively in mourning, and even her new physique. Cheryl in DBD is a lot skinnier than Heather in Silent Hill 3, which makes sense when you realise a lot of people lose the puppy fat that they gain in puberty. It's just another symbol of her growth and transformation. Cheryl dealing with the trauma of Harry's death through survivor's guilt and her attempts to bury that guilt in her new life is a really smart way to handle her post-Silent Hill 3 recovery. She's not actively in mourning anymore, but his absence still gnaws at her in a way that ties her to the symbol of guilt that followed her into the fog. Her past coming back to haunt her, with a probable hallucination of Claudia, is such a nice touch that reminds her that whatever's about to happen to her will not play by the rules she's used to. Speaking of old characters back with a vengeance in DBD, it's high time we talk about Ash Williams, played by the man himself, Bruce Campbell, and holy shit do I love Ash in Dead by Daylight. Look, I know it isn't young Ash, it's not a full chapter either, and I know and do wish that we got a killer for a full Evil Dead chapter, but like, what we got was still really damn cool. After his model update, Ash actually looks like Bruce Campbell now, and he's gotten more skins than most licensed characters get, including one recent one in Tome 15 based on his asylum look in Ash vs Evil Dead Season 2. Ash's lore was integrated into the game with a similar level of love, following up from the cliffhanger ending of Ash vs Evil Dead Season 3, as Ash attempts to travel back in time to reunite with his friends Pablo and Kelly and his daughter Brandy. Of course, Ash would fuck up the incantation and end up in the realm of the entity. That is completely on brand for Ash at this point. And self-referential voice lines that play in the lobby help to affirm this goofiness that has defined Ash since Army of Darkness. What was really nice was recently in Tome 15 we even got Ashy/Slashy story content appearing in his own story, where he turns alternate universe versions of Hattie, Jordan and their uncle Stefan into puppets, and chases them through the asylum while looking through his dumber namesake who's out in the fog somewhere. It's such a fun scene that brings back the fun of Ashy Slashy scenes in Ash vs Evil Dead Season 2, even down to him being a bit pervy to Hayley like he was towards Kelly. Ash vs Evil Dead may only be a small part of Dead by Daylight's mosaic of content, but it's one that's been pretty well maintained, and Ash remains a well-aged and charming part of the game's landscape. Not bad for a stock boy from Elk Grove, Michigan. Oh, and a full Ash video is coming, but the script is so far running over an hour, so give me some time to get it done, okay? While we're on the topic of older male celebrities who made it into the fog, this video would not be complete without recognising how good the adaptation of Nick Cage into Dead by Daylight was from a story and theme perspective. When Nick Cage was first announced for the game, when Nick Cage was leaked for the game, nobody really knew what they were expecting, but he's been a runaway success, and the general light-spirited tone of the release is perfectly personified in the lore we get. Cage, through his sheer enthusiasm for the craft of acting, is whisked off to a Pacific Island on a film set that definitely isn't a Black Veil stronghold, honest. I was amazed when we saw Pauline Stamper's name crop up. To this day, I'm still surprised that Nick Cage was actually expanding the wider lore of DBD in a way that he did. A fantastic survivor in what's been the highlight of the year so far for Dead by Daylight. Bravo, Mr. Cage. Another survivor who firmly belongs in the A tier is a newcomer from the Tools of Torment chapter earlier this year, Talita Lira. There's a word I can use to describe Talita's portrayal. It is genuine, because Talita is very much a real person in a lot of ways, as a part of a real and vibrant society. I've said this at least twice now in different videos, but seeing the life of somebody who always knew what she wanted, but took a long time to figure out how to get there and how she wanted to get it, is a great arc to see play out. And in the middle of some very serious survivor stories, it's nice to have some characters with some very low stakes, ordinary lives. Her tome shows us that it isn't all sunshine and rainbows, and affirms that despite her driven and focused attitude, she really has changed over time. Her growth into a fully realised adult is authentic, even as her goals remain unchanged since childhood. Talita is a really good character, one who I think is ironically overshadowed a little bit by her brother, we'll talk about him later, but still a really fun survivor who has a good chance of becoming a fan favourite as the years go on. Rounding out the A tier are Yunjin and Yoichi, two survivors who in terms of lore outshone their respective killers from the start. Yunjin marked a step forward for Dead by Daylight survivor lineup as someone whose moral ambiguity and pragmatic nature was placed first and foremost without villainizing her or justifying her. Unlike some characters I could mention, Yunjin's relative moral greyness was handled with intelligence and style, and enhanced her character as a result, especially when paired with a killer whose erratic, impulsive antics stand at odds with her no-nonsense professionalism. But the one I really want to talk about here is Yoichi Asakawa, because Yoichi's story has no right to be as good as it is. The Asakawa family hasn't been a part of Ringu since 1999, and when the survivor for the chapter was revealed to be Yoichi and not his mother Raiko, the leading lady of the first film, you could practically hear the knives sharpening from people who thought this chapter was going to be a flop. However, DBD's iteration of Yoichi has proven the doubters wrong because he's fantastic. Yoichi was a minor character in the first Ringu film, before taking center stage for the sequel, where the psychic powers that he implicitly was imbued with in the original movie became the central driving force for the sequel's plot. As he grew more powerful, he became closer to and more like Sadako, to the point that Yoichi almost drowned while Sadako was being excised from his body. Yoichi's DBD story picks him up where this leaves off, detailing his growth into an adult in a totally new way that still feels in keeping with established lore. Yoichi becomes a marine biologist, something that definitely checks out given the symbolism of water in Ringu as this impassive force of destruction and sorrow, and especially Sadako's connection to the water of the well, not to mention his own near drowning in the second film. He grows into an intrepid investigator as he tries to balance his scientific mind with his knowledge of ESP and supernatural goings-on. It's something fairly new to Ringu, but never fails to lose touch with the source material, and the whole thing was made with the blessing and cooperation of Kadokawa, the rights holders for Ringu. By developing Yoichi into an adult, Dead by Daylight has left just as indelible a mark on Ringu's canon as Ringu has the Dead by Daylight. The kind of thing you can't say about any other license, and that makes Yoichi a thoroughly deserved A tier character. Now that just leaves the best of the best, the S tiers. But before we get to them, I want to set one character apart here, because I thought about putting her in S tier, but on reflection I realised it simply wasn't fair to put her on the list at all. So existing outside of the tier list altogether in her own special category is my favourite survivor, Haddie Core. Haddie's lore is weird, because unlike most of the characters, Haddie was built up for years before her release, and continues to get constant lore in the Observer pages of the tomes to this day, making her by far the most written about character in Dead by Daylight history. Interestingly, these stories of Hattie don't always use the same versions of her, preferring instead to take different instances of the character from various alternate universes, such as the older Hattie, who is leading a resistance to the Black Veil in her universe, the 12 to Midnight stories, and Hayley, who we talked about before in the context of Ash's story. It's not clear which, if any, of the stories in the tomes are compatible with the Prime Hattie that we have playable in the game, but the platonic idea of Hattie remains constant. She can see the overlap between the entity's realm and the real world, and attempts to make sense of the horrors within in a life of adventure, nightmares, and daring do. Hattie's a super charming character, well deserving of the attention that she gets, but given just how much is written about her and how varied it is, it didn't feel right to try and put her on the list on the same metrics as the others. It felt like I was hosting a short story contest and Hattie rocked up with The Lord of the Rings. I really like it, and it is very impressive undoubtedly, but to take it on the same merits as the others would just sort of feel unfair to everyone. So Hattie gets her own special tier that for simplicity's sake I'm putting between A and S, but think of it more like she's outside of the list altogether. She's just sort of there, and for that I absolutely love her. So the actual S tier. Bottom of the S tier is our last licensed character in this video, Detective David Tapp from the Saw chapter. If you haven't read the tome story, and I know the majority of players don't read those things, you might not know why I put Tapp up here, especially when his counterpart the Pig appeared at the literal bottom of the last list I did. To answer that question, I seriously recommend taking a look at my Tapp video that I did back when the Saw tome came out, because there's too much good stuff in Tapp's tome story, Desecration of the Heart, to cover without bloating this video even more than it already is. Tapp is probably the most underused element of the original Saw, and due to the character's death he never comes back for a sequel. But Dead by Daylight unites the characterization he got in that film and in the first Saw video game to tell a genuinely heartfelt story of loss, duty, and the harmful consequences of extreme obsession that only gets amplified in quality if you've seen Saw and loved it as much as I have. I even did a little bit of digging into Saw's canonicity to look at where the lore fits in Saw's complicated as fuck timeline. And not only did the story slide seamlessly into the period before Tapp and things start working together, its presence also closed a plot hole in the Saw series that had existed for 14 years without ever being addressed before. Whether behaviour intended to close this plot hole with the story or not, we don't know, although I'm going to say probably not. The skill with which the story was written regardless is unignorable, and it paints a beautiful image of the Saw cop that inspired all the other Saw cops. A great love letter to my favourite horror franchise of all time. Next up in the S tier we have Elodie Rakoto, and everything good that's said about Felix before can be applied to Elodie on steroids. Elodie's lore develops the pariah storyline further from where Felix left us. While Felix's story examined his father's disappearance, mostly through how it affected him growing up and later fathering a child of his own, Elodie explored her family's disappearance through a wider lens. Far from Felix internalizing his trauma, Elodie lets it overtake her life completely, choosing to pursue the paper trail of her missing family to the ends of the earth, quite literally. As we follow her, we get to see more of the circumstances that took her family away, the cult of the entity known as the Black Veil and the Imperiati, secret society that sought to counteract the entity's influence on our world. Elodie's story sets the stage for many stories that we've already discussed on this list by providing probably the single most impactful piece of world building Dead by Daylight has ever had, and it's surprising that we've heard nothing more of the pariahs or the Imperiati since her, within such a big demand and potential for future stories starring them. Elodie is a likely candidate to receive a tome soon, but even if she doesn't get one, she remains one of DBD's highest impact survivors and a fantastic addition to the cast. Just above her on this list is a survivor I have a real long-lasting admiration for. Chains of Hate's intrepid documentarian Zarina Kassir. Zarina's story is more or less everything I like in survivor stories all wrapped up together. She's a believable and charming character whose story feels authentic and parallels the themes of her associated killer without it being too obvious or dominating the narrative. She grew up from a background of discrimination, and a major part of her growth into a young woman is coming to terms with that and embracing her cultural identity as a part of her life. I love this because while Dead by Daylight has its fair share of characters with immigrant backgrounds, Zarina's story easily devotes the most time and attention to it, and reflects the lives of a lot of second-generation immigrants as a result. But her story is so much more than that. Handling ideas like discrimination, speaking truth to power, and prison skepticism with taste, not being too preachy or on the nose about it, but definitely with a strong message that paints a picture of Zarina's fractured relationship with the establishment. If I could pick the next survivor to get a tome, it would be either Adam or Zarina, because she's absolutely fantastic and well overdue some more lore. And now we're breaking into the top 3. In third place we have David King. Dead by Daylight's to date a new representation for a very important and underappreciated group of people, the British. And this isn't just me playing to the judge here because he's one of the lads, but also because his 2.5 tome stories have carefully built him as a character, from a man M. Cote personally described as a shithead into one of the game's most beloved characters. Far from many survivors whose internal struggles mostly exist as a consequence of their external ones, David's nature as an emotionally volatile guy prone to thinking with his fists rather than his head is as much an impediment to him as his external circumstances. And given how many survivors tend to be fairly one-note good people, there's some complexity there. Regardless of how sympathetic he is, David's kind of his own worst enemy, and when his first tome came around, this set up his story. His love of fighting wasn't an obsession or an addiction, but something fundamentally coded into his way of life, and is treated with a degree of moral neutrality as a result. His urge to fight gets him and Donnie into trouble, and it gets him and Donnie out of it too. To say he inhabited a moral grey area would be like saying a thunderstorm has questionable ethics. Such concepts are irrelevant when they're just a fact of life. But it isn't till David's second tome, The Importance of Being King, that we see how someone who punches their way through life manages to actually get through life when he isn't punching things, and the answer is poorly, to say the least. Due to growing up in a homophobic environment, David wound up repressing his sexuality, and that caused a lot of angst, a burning wish for what he'd never been allowed to have. And as somebody who's never been terribly in touch with his emotions in any way more complex than I'm angry so I punch something, it takes a lot for David to be able to grow. And a lot of pain and rage and self-reflection later, he ultimately does. He doesn't come out of it materially better, but he comes out the other side of his story a more complete person, finally accepting that Tristan's gone, and that's kind of okay. David isn't a saint, but he's better understood this time around, and the whole thing comes together with taste, depth and emotional intelligence. It means that David's status as the game's first intentional LGBT+ representation, while valuable, is just a small part of what makes his lore so good. It gives him some flavour but doesn't define him completely. And while we haven't had any explicitly LGBT+ characters since him, David marks a fantastic first step. Okay, the top spot is pretty tight, but in second place for Dead by Daylight's best written survivor, a whole tier above his sister, I've got to give it to Renato Lira. I can't begin to tell you how cool this wonderful fellow is. Well, I can because I've made 2 videos dedicated largely to the topic, but all the same, Renato is a survivor I hold very close to my heart. Renato is a sign of how far behaviour has come in telling survivor stories. You know, everything I said about Claudette's story, where I claimed it reduced the experience of autistic people down to those of a child whose neurodivergency becomes a burden for their parents, is that something that they personally have to live with? Yeah, well, Renato's lore handles it in completely the right way, and it does so as part of building his character up comprehensively. Renato's autistic traits aren't a footnote that can be ignored, but nor do they completely define him. They simply serve as a way to explore the growth of a young man who hasn't got it all figured out yet. Someone who you can understand and root for, who's different from his sister, and in a way that elevates them both. In a bustling city like Rio, where family relationships and socialising are closer than they are in the UK or US, Renato accepting his differences from his family without resenting them for it or tending into self-loathing is a wonderful message, the kind of thing I and a lot of other neurodivergent youngsters would have loved to hear. On a lot of people's tier lists, I get why he might be lower, but for me, Renato Lira is everything good a new survivor can be, and I'm so glad he's here. Which just leaves the top spot to go. I'm sure anybody keeping track of the list has already figured out that the tippy top, the creme de la creme, the best survivor lore in Dead by Daylight is Yui Kimura. Now let me be clear. Yui isn't necessarily my favourite survivor. I think I can say that I like most of S tier and even a fair few in A more than I like her. But in terms of robustness and sheer quality, I don't think Yui can be beaten. DBD's Japanese stories have tended to revolve around concepts like legacy and family and honour, and Yui's existence brings these themes to bear in a story of struggle and success that feels modern and revolutionary as it stands in contrast to the Yamaoka family's emphasis on tradition. Yui tells a story of someone standing up against the constricting bonds of tradition, and I love that it isn't just some kind of ideological divide that she has, but more that she just wants to live her life, and if that means dismantling an entire misogynistic power structure, Yui has the drive and the will to do it, to live the life she wants to. The Sakura 7 biker gang she winds up leading forms around her naturally, because someone with Yui's unbreakable resolve, someone who will go against the grain of what society expected of her to get what she wants, will always find themselves in a position of leadership from other people who feel the same way. Yui represents freedom on a deeply individual level that can easily snowball into a movement. Someone who would take on the world alone but has earned the respect of her peers and will thus never have to. And it's all done with serious coherency and dedication to building the best character they can. Yui Kimura is not my favourite survivor. I like her, but she's not my favourite. And yet I have to concede that I don't think there's a single thing about Yui's lore that I would change at all. It does exactly what it sets out to do pretty much perfectly. It blazes a trail for more in-depth and thematically consistent stories, and as a result, I feel obliged to affirm it as the best survivor story in Dead by Daylight. DBD's survivor lineup always seems to play second fiddle to its killers, but that's not to say there aren't some high quality stories to be found here. From Portrait of a Murder onwards, I think it's safe to say survivor lore has been on a general downward turn, with the Leader siblings being the only survivors of note in that time for me. But it's clear that Behaviour can write good survivor stories, and with upcoming Tome 17, likely starring an older original survivor as well as another solo survivor coming in the Chapter 30 mid-chapter, I can't say I'm not excited to see what's in store for the future. So, what do we think of my little tier list? I say little, it's actually quite large. What do we think of it anyway? Am I right? Am I wrong? Are the two Jonah lovers on planet Earth going to crawl out of the woodwork and publish my address on 4chan? Let's find out. But before we do, there is a little button called the subscribe button that it would be very cool if you press, and the like button if you like the video. Special thanks to my beautiful patrons who get access to these videos a day early, and a bunch of other cool perks. If you're interested, drop in the channel a little bit of the cash money, and fancy having a look at these cool perks, then do go check it out, links in the description. And on that note, I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.